The sky above Tunisia on February 1st, 1943, roared with the fury of aerial combat. Dozens of American bombers carved their way across enemy lines, their mission clear: cripple Axis supply routes and establish dominance over the Mediterranean. Among them flew the B-17 Flying Fortress All-American III, commanded by Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg. For the men inside, it was another day of endurance against flak bursts and determined German fighters. Yet none could have foreseen that this mission would etch their names into aviation legend. As the formation crossed enemy territory, Messerschmitt Bf-109s dove in from above, engines howling. German pilots sought to break apart the bomber box, to tear isolated fortresses from their protective formation. Tracers stitched the air, striking aluminum and engines. It was here, amid the chaos, that one German fighter sealed his fate. Erich Paczia, a Luftwaffe pilot, collided with Bragg's B-17 during a high-speed pass. The impact was catastrophic. Metal shrieked as the Messerschmitt tore into the tail section, shearing control surfaces and leaving the bomber's fuselage dangling by little more than twisted aluminum. Inside the B-17, silence fell for a fraction of a second before the crew realized what had happened. The tail gunner clung to life as the bomber shuddered violently. By all laws of aerodynamics, All-American III should have spiraled into the ground. German fighters circled, certain they had witnessed the bomber's final moments. But to their shock, the B-17 refused to fall. With its tail nearly severed, the Flying Fortress somehow kept flying. This was more than an accident. It was the beginning of one of World War II's most remarkable survival stories, a testament to both engineering brilliance and human determination. German pilots, accustomed to seeing crippled bombers break apart in flames, were stunned by the sight of an aircraft flying with half its body gone. The legend of the Flying Fortress's durability was no longer propaganda. It was alive before their eyes. If you're fascinated by these incredible true stories of World War II that reveal how sheer grit and innovation shaped history, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more untold accounts of courage and survival. The men aboard All-American III had no idea that the hardest part of their mission had only just begun. The cockpit of All-American III was chaos. Instruments rattled wildly, warning lights flickered, and the yoke fought against Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg's hands, as if the bomber itself were trying to break free. Behind him, the tail section hung by twisted metal, the stabilizer torn open, its structure swaying like a pendulum in the slipstream. Inside that shattered compartment, the tail gunner, Sergeant Sam Sarpelis, clung to life. His position had been partially ripped away, leaving him exposed to the freezing sky rushing past at hundreds of miles per hour. Every second felt borrowed. Bragg shouted commands, his voice almost drowned by the roaring wind that tore through gaps in the fuselage. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Godfrey Vogt, leaned with all his weight on the controls, trying to counteract the bomber's tendency to yaw violently. Flying level had become nearly impossible. One wrong adjustment, and the entire rear fuselage could shear away, dooming all 10 men aboard. Behind them, German fighters lingered. At first, the Luftwaffe pilots circled, expecting the B-17 to disintegrate. Instead, they were confronted with an almost supernatural sight. A bomber, gutted and broken, somehow clawing its way forward in defiance of physics. Shock rippled through their ranks. Radio chatter later recorded described the Americans' plane as a ghost that refused to die. This disbelief caused hesitation. Critical seconds where German pilots might have finished the kill were lost in astonishment. Inside, the crew improvised. Waist gunners used belts, cables, and anything they could grab to secure the tail section. They knew it might not hold, but every ounce of weight mattered. The radio operator tried to signal their formation, but transmission was intermittent. Jolted wires sparked as if even the bomber's veins were severed. Yet through all this, the crew never abandoned their post. Machine gunners remained vigilant, firing bursts to keep the Messerschmitts at bay. At that moment, All-American III was not merely an aircraft, it was a testament to resilience. The fortress's reputation for toughness had become legend, but this day, That myth took flesh. For the Germans circling above Tunisia, watching in disbelief, the message was clear. America had built a machine that refused to die, and men who refused to surrender. The decision was made. Turning back to base was the only option, but it meant flying nearly 90 minutes with a bomber that should not even be airborne. Lieutenant Bragg tightened his grip on the controls, feeling the weight of every second. The all-American 3 was now a crippled giant, shaking with each gust of wind, its tail twisting dangerously with every vibration. The crew knew the odds were against them, yet no one spoke of abandoning ship. At 12,000 feet, the fortress limped forward. The fractured rear end groaned like a wounded animal, swaying so violently that at times it seemed certain to break free. Bragg and co-pilot Vogt carefully balanced throttle and rudder input, finding a delicate rhythm that kept the bomber just stable enough. Any sharp maneuver would have torn the plane apart. Inside the fuselage, gunners and crewmen worked frantically to reinforce the failing structure. They tied parachute cords around exposed beams, used spare oxygen tanks to wedge against loose panels, and even stripped personal gear to lighten the load. The radio operator, Sergeant Ralph Burbridge, tried repeatedly to reach their base at Biskra, but static plagued every call. Despite damaged antennas, he managed to send intermittent signals, enough for ground crews to prepare for the impossible, a B-17 returning home in pieces. Outside, German fighters occasionally reappeared, trailing like vultures circling dying prey. Yet the sight of the fortress still flying unnerved them. Instead of finishing the kill, many hung back, unwilling to waste ammunition on what they believed gravity would soon claim. Their hesitation granted All-American 3 precious minutes. For the men inside, each one was an eternity. Conversation was sparse. They were all too aware of what awaited if the tail finally gave way. The crew rotated between silence and nervous humor, gallows jokes that masked fear. Burbridge later recalled that no one dared look back too long at the tail section because watching it sway made the inevitable feel closer. But with every mile gained, hope grew. What had seemed impossible, reaching friendly skies, was now within reach. Still, the greatest challenge lay ahead: how to land a bomber barely holding together. The desert airfield at Biskra came into view, a speck of salvation surrounded by the sands of Algeria. For the men aboard All-American 3, it felt like a mirage, so close, yet still an eternity away. Every shudder of the bomber threatened to rip the tail completely free. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg and co-pilot Godfrey Vogt exchanged quick, silent glances. Both understood the same truth. Keeping the plane in the air had been hard enough. Landing it might prove impossible. The crew prepared for the final act. Waist gunners secured ammunition belts, not for combat, but to strap down swaying panels. The navigator sketched rough diagrams of the airfield on scraps of paper so each man knew where to brace for impact. The tail gunner, Sarpalus, had been dragged into the fuselage, his position far too unstable to remain in. His face was pale, wind-burned from exposure, but he nodded grimly. He was ready. From the control tower, ground crews stared in disbelief. Through binoculars, they saw the B-17's rear section hanging by threads of metal. Mechanics later recalled that it looked less like an airplane and more like a kite tethered to its fuselage. Officers debated ordering the crew to bail out, but the fortress was already too low and too fragile for 10 parachutes to spill from its belly without catastrophic imbalance. Bragg's plan was simple, though execution bordered on madness. Keep the approach steady, reduce throttle gradually, and touch down with the gentlest impact possible. Any sudden descent would snap the tail clean off before the wheels met the ground. The co-pilot called out airspeed, too high, too dangerous. Vogt trimmed the engines, bringing the plane into a slow, agonizing glide. Inside, silence fell. Men clutched at straps, at fragments of aluminum, at anything that offered a sense of control. The bomber descended, its shadow stretching across the desert. Every creak of metal sounded like the beginning of collapse. The runway rushed up to meet them. Bragg held his breath and eased the controls. Tires screamed as they kissed earth, the fortress bouncing once before settling. The tail sagged, twisting violently, but miraculously held until momentum slowed. Then, with a final groan, the rear section collapsed, folding into the dust. They had landed the impossible. When the All-American 3 finally came to rest, a strange hush swept over the desert airfield. Engines coughed into silence, their vibrations fading after nearly 2 hours of tension. For a heartbeat, no one moved inside the battered fortress. It was as if the crew could not quite believe that solid ground was beneath them, that gravity had not claimed them mid-air. Then the spell broke. Waist gunner Sam Sarpelis slumped forward, releasing a ragged laugh that turned into a cough. Navigator Charles Moore let go of the maps clutched in his hands, paper fluttering to the deck. One by one, helmets were pulled off, oxygen masks unhooked, and breaths came out heavy. Half relief, half exhaustion. For these 10 men, every second since the collision had been a borrowed moment. Outside, mechanics and medics rushed toward the crippled bomber. What they saw left them stunned. The tail section, barely recognizable, had torn free and lay twisted in the dust behind the fortress. Jagged ribs of aluminum gleamed under the African sun like exposed bone. To see the aircraft standing upright at all was a violation of logic, proof of some unspoken resilience built into its frame. Ground crews clambered aboard through the nose hatch, helping the crew descend. Medics immediately tended to Sarpelis, who had endured the worst of the ordeal. Yet his injuries were minor compared to what everyone had expected. Not a single man had been lost. It was, in the words of one officer, an impossible delivery. 10 men delivered back to Earth intact. German prisoners of war held nearby later confirmed their own disbelief. From their camp fences, some had glimpsed the approach, convinced the plane would disintegrate in mid-air. To them, the survival of the All-American 3 reinforced the legend they already whispered about the B-17, that it was less an aircraft than a flying fortress forged to defy destruction. As the crew stood beside their broken machine, silence returned. For the first time, they allowed themselves to grasp what had happened. The flight back had been more gamble than science, a dance with chance where each mile might have been their last. The fortress lay in ruins, but the men still stood, proof that survival itself could be a kind of victory. News of the All-American 3 did not stop at the Allied airfield. Within hours, German intelligence officers were studying reports from Luftwaffe pilots who had witnessed the collision. For them, the incident was more than remarkable. It was unsettling. German ace Erich Paczia, the pilot whose Messerschmitt Bf-109 had struck the fortress, had perished instantly in the crash. His comrades, circling above, fully expected the American bomber to tumble in pieces toward the sands of Tunisia. Yet instead, they watched in disbelief as the mangled B-17 stubbornly leveled out and clawed its way toward the horizon, leaving behind a trail of smoke and shuddering metal. For Luftwaffe strategists, this was a disturbing revelation. The B-17 Flying Fortress had already earned a reputation for durability, but this episode suggested something more. It hinted that the aircraft could absorb catastrophic damage and still fulfill its mission of returning crew alive. In war, perception mattered almost as much as firepower. German morale, built on the efficiency of their air superiority, now faced the image of a bomber that refused to die. In Berlin, intelligence officers compiled testimonies from pilots who had engaged American bombers. Reports described fortresses limping home on 3 engines, riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, their fuselages torn, yet still airborne. The All-American 3 incident became the most dramatic example, circulated through Luftwaffe briefings as evidence that downing a single fortress often required far more firepower and sometimes luck than previously assumed. Pilots grumbled that even concentrated bursts from cannon and machine guns failed to bring down formations quickly. Tactics had to evolve. No longer could fighters simply rake through bomber streams with expectation of easy kills. The Luftwaffe began experimenting with massed frontal assaults, heavier cannons, and explosive rockets to break apart the dense boxes of fortresses that seemed impervious to conventional attack. Among German rank-and-file aviators, however, the tale of the Piggyback B-17 carried another effect: respect. Though enemies, they recognized the raw resilience of the aircraft and the skill of the men inside. One Luftwaffe pilot later admitted in his diary that seeing the fortress fly on was like watching a ghost refuse burial. The shockwaves of that day rippled beyond tactics and charts. It reminded the Luftwaffe that technology, when paired with human will, could turn battles into legends, and legends, once born, had a way of outliving the war itself. When the All-American 3 finally touched down, the photographs taken of its mangled fuselage spread rapidly through Allied channels. What had been a near disaster quickly transformed into a powerful narrative tool, one that American commanders understood could lift spirits and harden resolve. The images were staggering. The B-17's tail was nearly severed, the horizontal stabilizer twisted like scrap, and yet the plane had not only survived enemy fire, but had returned its crew safely to base. For soldiers and civilians alike, the message was unmistakable. American engineering had produced a machine that could withstand anything the enemy threw at it. The U.S. Army Air Forces wasted little time turning the All-American 3 into legend. Articles appeared in Stars and Stripes, celebrating the bomber's return as proof of the Flying Fortress name. The photographs were circulated widely, often with captions emphasizing the aircraft's indestructibility. For aircrews preparing for their next missions, the story served as reassurance that survival, even under impossible conditions, was achievable. Back home, newspapers picked up the story. Families who had sons flying in daylight raids over Europe and North Africa saw the battered fortress as a symbol of hope. It reassured them that despite the dangers, American bombers had a fighting chance. War bond posters even drew inspiration from the tale, subtly connecting the resilience of the aircraft to the resilience of the nation itself. Commanders also recognized the strategic impact of morale. Keeping crews confident was critical, especially during the brutal early campaigns when losses were high. A single story of miraculous survival could inspire hundreds of men to climb back into their bombers with renewed determination. If that crew could make it back, many thought, so can we. The All-American 3 became more than a machine. It became a legend shared in briefings, retold in barracks, and repeated in letters sent home. Every retelling magnified its symbolic weight. What began as a terrifying ordeal for 10 airmen transformed into a rallying cry that reached from Tunisian airstrips to the American heartland. Through calculated publicity, the U.S. turned one miraculous flight into a cultural weapon, proving that sometimes survival alone could strike harder than bombs. Behind the legend of the All-American 3 stood not just luck, but the genius of American engineering. The B-17 Flying Fortress was more than a bomber. It was a fortress in the sky, designed with one philosophy above all: survivability. Boeing's engineers had envisioned a machine that could bring crews home even when torn apart, and on February 1, 1943, their vision was tested like never before. The B-17's durability came from its robust airframe. Instead of relying on a single structural point, its skeleton was built with multiple load-bearing members that distributed stress across the fuselage. This redundancy meant that even if large sections were destroyed, as in the case of the All-American 3's tail, the aircraft could still retain enough integrity to keep flying. Where a lesser design might have folded, the fortress endured. Another key feature was the separation of critical systems. Hydraulic lines, electrical wiring, and control cables were deliberately routed along different paths, ensuring that a single hit would not cripple the plane entirely. In the Tunisian miracle, pilots were able to keep control despite massive structural loss because alternate control lines remained functional. This foresight in design was not an accident, but a deliberate lesson learned from earlier conflicts. Armor protection also played a role. While the B-17 was far from invincible, its vital areas, cockpit, fuel tanks, and engines, were shielded with reinforced plating and self-sealing tanks. During the collision, fires that might have consumed another bomber were prevented, giving the crew crucial time to fight for survival. Even the aircraft's sheer size and weight helped. The B-17 could absorb punishment that would have destroyed smaller bombers. Its 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines added another layer of resilience. With power spread across multiple units, the bomber could limp home on 1 or 2 functioning engines, and in the case of All-American 3, still maintain enough thrust to remain airborne. The result was a flying contradiction, an aircraft that could be riddled with holes, missing entire sections, and yet stubbornly remain aloft. For German pilots, this durability was both infuriating and demoralizing. They could pour ammunition into a fortress, watch it stagger, and still see it vanish into the clouds on its way home. In Tunisia, the All-American 3 didn't just prove the worth of its crew. It proved that Boeing's design philosophy worked. Engineering, not just courage, made miracles possible. When news of the All-American 3 spread, it wasn't just a tale whispered among American airmen. It reached the command desks of the Luftwaffe. German intelligence officers studied the reports and photographs with disbelief. Here was a bomber that should have disintegrated, yet it had limped back to base. For the German fighter corps, who relied on high-speed interceptions and aggressive ramming when necessary, this incident was a chilling reminder that their tactics might no longer guarantee results. Until then, Luftwaffe pilots viewed American bombers as formidable but ultimately vulnerable targets. They had learned to focus fire on weak points, the tail, engines, or cockpit. Precision bursts from a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf often set off chain reactions that crippled enemy aircraft. But the Tunisian event demonstrated that the B-17 could remain airborne even after catastrophic damage. If one bomber could defy destruction, how many others could as well? Strategists began to reconsider the cost of head-on attacks and ramming maneuvers. German commanders had encouraged desperation tactics in the belief that overwhelming damage would doom the enemy. Instead, they realized that American bombers might survive those very collisions, leaving German pilots dead and resources wasted. Erich Paczia's fatal collision served as a grim example. His sacrifice hadn't destroyed the bomber, and the Luftwaffe had lost an experienced ace. The psychological toll was immense. Luftwaffe pilots already faced swarms of defensive guns from tight B-17 formations, which made each attack a gamble. Now, the notion that even crippling damage might not bring a fortress down added a new layer of dread. Reports circulated of crews emptying their cannons into bombers only to watch them limp away, smoking but alive. Morale began to erode. This realization also had operational consequences. German high command shifted resources toward heavier armament, including the use of 30mm cannons designed to shatter bomber formations with fewer hits. They also experimented with rocket attacks, hoping to break apart groups of B-17s without closing into suicidal range. Yet even these changes underscored a troubling truth. The Allies had built a machine that forced the Luftwaffe to adapt constantly, while Germany's own production struggled to keep pace. In effect, the survival of the All-American 3 was more than an aviation miracle. It was a symbol. It told German pilots that brute force alone would not be enough, and it foreshadowed the eventual collapse of Luftwaffe air superiority. As the battered All-American 3 approached its home base in Biskra, every man aboard knew they were attempting the impossible. The tail, barely connected by shredded aluminum, swung wildly with every gust. Control cables were frayed, hydraulics nearly useless, and the bomber's entire frame shuddered under the strain of flight. Yet Kendrick Bragg and his co-pilot refused to surrender. They coaxed the fortress forward, one trembling mile at a time, praying the structure would hold just long enough to touch Earth. Ground crews spotted the incoming aircraft and prepared for disaster. Medics stood ready, fire trucks lined the runway, and mechanics braced themselves for wreckage. From a distance, the B-17 appeared to be flying in 2 pieces, its tail dangling like a broken limb. And yet, it descended with uncanny steadiness, guided by sheer willpower and the stubborn resilience of its design. When the wheels finally struck the tarmac, cheers erupted. But the ordeal wasn't over. The violent jolt of landing tore away what little metal held the tail section together. With a final groan, the rear of the plane collapsed onto the runway, scattering fragments of aluminum across the airfield. Against all odds, every man aboard walked away alive. Their survival wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was a testament to engineering brilliance and crew determination. Word of the landing spread across Allied air bases like wildfire. Crews gathered around the wreckage, running their hands along the torn fuselage in disbelief. The bomber's survival became a rallying cry, proof that the Flying Fortress lived up to its name. For men preparing for their next missions into flak-filled skies, it offered a kind of hope no briefing or pep talk could deliver. For the Germans, who soon received reports and photographs, it was a sobering reminder of what they faced. If American bombers could return from collisions that should have shredded them, how could the Reich possibly win a war of attrition against such machines? Decades later, the story of All-American 3 remains one of aviation's most celebrated survival tales. Museums, books, and documentaries keep its memory alive, not only as an example of wartime grit, but as a lesson in human ingenuity. The bomber that should have fallen from the skies instead wrote itself into history, showing that sometimes machines, and the men who fly them, can achieve the impossible.